Everybody doing good? Pretty well? I just want to read a few scriptures. Here we are, the day after Christmas, when much of the world celebrates the birth of Jesus. Now, I personally don't believe Jesus was born on December 25th, and we'll talk about that. I feel like I'm going to major on it, but I don't want to major on that. But I'm looking at all the verses I have, and we're probably going to talk about that a lot. But there will be a point at the end. But I want to read these couple passages, probably ones that whether you went to church or not growing up, you probably heard these if you ever walked by a nativity scene, or maybe it was playing over an intercom or something like that in the store. I don't know. But these are very common scriptures that we hear during this time of year. So Isaiah 7:14, it says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. And then Isaiah 9, verse 6, it says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. And his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts," or the God who commands angel armies, "will do this." So here we have this promise of a woman, a virgin, conceiving a child, bearing a son. That child would be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. I think it's interesting, the child is called Mighty God. A human child is called Mighty God. And what did it say in Isaiah 7? His name shall be called Emmanuel, or Immanuel, which is God with us. You look at that in, I think it's in Matthew's gospel, where Gabriel comes and says, his name shall be called Emmanuel. And then at the end, which means God with us, right? Then at the end of Matthew's gospel, when Jesus gives them the Great Commission and he sends them out, he says, "Behold, I am with you." Who's with you? God is with you. God with us. So it's these bookends at the beginning and the end of Matthew's gospel. God with us, even unto the end of the age. And so that promise still stands today. So here we are in this season, and as I mentioned, I don't believe Jesus was born during this season. And I think there's a number of reasons why this time has become that. People talk about the pagan associations, which there surely are. But there was also a diligent search for the time that Jesus was born, and people were very interested in that. And so if you look even today, I don't know if you know any folks that are Orthodox, but they celebrate Jesus' birth on January 6th. Did you know that? They have their whole other day that they celebrate. So there was a diligent search, and maybe misguided, maybe they didn't have all the information or the facts. The honest reality is, anybody who tells you that they know 100% Jesus was born, they don't really. At the end of the day. Now, I think there's really compelling evidence, and I'm going to present that before you actually this morning, that I feel like we can really have a strong inkling, at least, of when Jesus was born. I find it really compelling. We'll see if you find it compelling. And so we'll talk about that here in just a few moments. But let's start here I want to read a scripture in Romans 10. So turn with me, if you would, Romans 10. We're really going to focus in on verse 18, but I'll kind of catch you up to speed with just a little bit of it. This famous chapter And I think it'll help us kind of zero in on what are we actually looking for. When could Jesus have been born? I remember years ago a case being made that you could figure out when Jesus was born because of a detail in Luke's gospel. Luke chapter 1, we're told that Zacharias, which is John the Baptist's father, he's from the division, the priestly class or division of Abiah, okay? And if you go back to your Old Testament, it's in 1st or 2nd Chronicles. Sorry, I don't have the address on that one. We're told that David set up these 24 divisions of the priestly line, right? And so here's the basic idea that's thrown out. If you look at those 24 divisions, Abiah is number 8. And so here's the idea, and I wish I knew more about this. I should probably study it more. The idea is that you've got 3 major pilgrimage feasts, right? You've got Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, right? Where everybody, all males, had to come to Jerusalem. So those 3 weeks out of the year, all priests were serving in the temple. This is the idea, okay? And then you take a biblical year, which was more like 360 days instead of 365. That's why they had to add an extra month every so many years. They still do that today. So you got really more of like a 51-week year instead of a 52-week year. Does that make sense? Okay. So then we got those 3 weeks. I know we're doing math here. It's too early. It's the weekend. So you got 51 weeks, and you have those 3 major pilgrimage feasts, right? So subtract 3 from 51, and you get 48, right? So here's the idea. 24 divisions. Each division is going to serve 2 weeks out of the year. Does that make sense? Where they get that from, I don't know. I mean, it makes sense. It's logical. Maybe there's something in the rabbinic writings that I'm missing, and some of you will probably come up to me and fill me in on how woefully uninformed I am. That's fine. You do that. So here's the idea. If he's of the course of Abiah, the division of Abiah, and that happens to be the 8th division, okay, so we know we got Passover in there, right? So then we move forward another count 8 weeks or whatever, and that puts you somewhere in the early June region, right? Okay? But then you know and this is assuming that Elizabeth gets pregnant soon thereafter, right? Because you know when Zechariah's in the temple, maybe I should catch everybody up to speed. You know the story. Zechariah's in the temple. The angel comes to him, says, you're going to have a son. He says, how's this going to happen? And he's like, you fool, you're not going to be able to talk. I mean, something like that, right? So he can't talk. And then we find out Mary gets a visit from Gabriel. And we're told that that Gabriel tells Mary, Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant. She's in her 6th month, okay? So if Elizabeth got pregnant, I know this is like really heady. Elizabeth got pregnant in June, right? This is counting those weeks up from, okay. If Elizabeth got pregnant in June, what's 6 months from June? December, which could be around Hanukkah time, maybe, somewhere in there, right? And then if you go another 9 months from December, where does that land you? September, right, which puts you in the fall, right? And so then, so they'll say, well, that makes sense. Now you're hanging a lot on it. I'm just being honest, you're hanging a lot on that you figured the right day, because what if he was there on one of his other, he could have been there later in the year. Because if he's doing 2 weeks, you assume he's got one shift early in the year and then one shift later in the year. Yeah, I'm just saying, you're hanging a lot on it. And then you're assuming that a pregnancy is like exactly 9 months, which I'm just saying, we had a 10-month pregnancy. We were a sign and a wonder. Not every woman gives birth in exactly 9 months. So, I mean, it could have been way earlier, could have been later. But, give or take. Give or take a month. And then, so that puts you in the fall. And then I've heard a lot of people say, I'm just being honest, I don't know this. And so when people say, yes, it was for sure this time of year, they're hanging a lot on a Just little details. So then you've got John 1, verse 14, that says, the Word became flesh and tabernacled, dwelt among us, right? That word dwelt there, the Greek word is for pitching a tent, for setting up a tabernacle. And so people will say, well, see there, John is telling us that Jesus was born during the Feast of Tabernacles. Maybe. It could have been. I love that. I think it's beautiful. And I do personally believe that Jesus was born during the fall. I'm going to come at it from a little different angle that will maybe just help support what we just talked about, which was confusing enough, probably to some of us. What I'm about to talk about may or may not be more confusing. Just prep you. I had an image, and it was all ready to go, and then I forgot to bring the computer. So you're all going to have to use your imagination. So, are you ready for this? Okay, so here we are, Romans chapter 10. Famous passage in verse 13. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved, right? And then Paul goes on to say, well, how will they call on him if they've not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel, for Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? And so faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. So this big push of Paul saying, hey, people can't hear and believe the message if people don't go and send. It's this big thrust of like, we need to see people sent out to proclaim the good news. And then he makes this statement that if you've read it and it didn't confuse you, you probably didn't read it. He says, but I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have. It's like, well, Paul, you just said, how are they going to hear unless somebody's sent to them? So then he makes this statement, have they not heard? Indeed they have, for, and this is a quotation from the Old Testament, it says, their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. Now the question is, whose voice? So we might want to go look at where Paul's getting this passage from, right? So let's go back. This is Psalms 19. Yeah, if you got good footnotes in your Bible, that probably tell you. So Psalm 19, let's turn there really quickly. I hope this is okay. Is everybody doing good? Okay, Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. What is the psalmist talking about? Whose voice is it? Whose words? Clues in verse 1. The heavens, right? Yeah, the heavens and the skies above. So what seems to be going on here is Paul is saying, hey, listen, people need to hear the gospel. And for that to happen, people need to be sent out to proclaim the gospel. But even if they've never heard the gospel preached to them, they've still heard. Why? Because the heavens declared it. The heavens declared it. Now that's maybe confusing to us because we live in a modern world where we don't think often that the heavens have a message. And I want to be clear from the outset, I'm not talking about astrology and looking at our zodiac or anything like that. The heavens were created by the Lord. The heavens are his handiwork, and we're told here in Psalm 33, where by the word of the Lord By his breath, the heavens were made and all the host. And we're told here in Psalm 19, they declare the glory of God. I don't have this passage in my notes here, but Genesis 1, first page of your Bible, should be easy to find. Genesis 1, in verse 14, God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." So for signs and for seasons, we're not just talking about summer, winter, and fall here. The word here for seasons is the word moedim, which is the same word that's used in Leviticus 23 and other places to talk about God's special appointed times, right? And when you look at those appointed times, they're often determined by the moon. Is it a new moon? Halfway through the moon cycle. So they're actually used to determine specific appointed times where they have feasts and festivals, celebrating what God has done, remembering what he's done, humbling themselves. That's the Day of Atonement. So, and then you've got Job 38, and I won't read this one, where God comes and he's speaking to Job, and he said, "Hey, Job, did you create the Pleiades and Orion and the Bear and Mazzaroth?" These are all references to constellations, okay? So there is a biblical understanding that God created the heavens, and if he wants to, he can communicate through them. This is much different than astrology. We understand this, right? The point is the source, right? Am I looking to the heavens to somehow divine the will of the gods, or somehow control my own fate, or figure out my destiny? Or do I have this understanding that God created everything, he created the heavens, and if he deems fit, he can communicate through that reality? We know this just straight from the Christmas story. How did the Magi find Jesus? They saw a star. How did they just see a star if they weren't actually looking up and saying, "I wonder if God is trying to communicate to us"? This is, I know this sounds like really basic level stuff, but I'm trying to pull apart two ideas that have been entwined in Christendom, that we think that any seeing God communicating through the heavens must be some type of weird astrology, and I'm saying there is a difference, and hopefully I'm making that clear. It's all about the source. It's all about who we're looking to. If God is the one who created it, I'm looking to him. I'm not trying to figure out my destiny and all that by reading the zodiac each month, or like, what's going on in the stars? I can't do anything, and are the planets aligning? No. I understand God is communicating through everything, right? And he can communicate through that. Okay, this is good. We're on the same page here. So, with all that in mind, people think about the star that the wise men followed. And for many, many years now, this idea of a star that moves and seems to stop, Jupiter, the planet, has been the big contender, because it's well known in astronomy that Jupiter does this thing called retrograde motion, where it seems like in the sky over time that Jupiter can move back and forth, it can stop, and it all has to do with how our planets are moving and all that stuff, right? So people look to Jupiter and they try to figure out, okay, what would have created this star? And so they say, well, it must have been some type of conjunction, which is a fancy word to where two stars or two planets align and it creates what looks like a megastar, okay? Very visible in the sky, and since Jupiter, we know, moves around, Jupiter must have come into conjunction with some other star or planet. Now, you probably heard in the news all this talk about Jupiter and Saturn, this conjunction, and this is the Bethlehem star. I don't think that was what they were looking at. And we'll look at this here. Let's turn to Revelation 12, because this passage is often not considered when people talk about what would have been, what those two stars or two planets coming together would have looked like. So this one's often not considered because, again, we live in a modern world and not in an ancient world. In an ancient world where there was a belief and an understanding that God was communicating through the heavens. And so Revelation 12, as we read it, seems to be this really figurative prophecy or word that clearly seems to be pointing to the birth of Jesus, but then even going beyond that and looking forward to a period known as the Great Tribulation. But what is often not considered is just reading this on its face and considering, could this be referring to something actually happening in the heavens? Okay. Because what does it say? Revelation 12, verse 1. And a great sign, a sign. What did Genesis say the sun, moon, and stars were for? Signs and seasons. Appointed times, right? So it says, a great sign appeared in heaven. So this is where my image would have helped you. So you're just going to have to picture this. Use your imagination. A woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. So you have the sun, the moon, and the stars. What did Genesis 1 say those were for? Signs. We're getting it. All right, so great sign appeared in heaven. Here we have this woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, okay? I'm just going to read through some of the passage, and then we'll talk about it in a minute. It says, she was pregnant, was crying out in birth pains, and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth, which this verse, by the way, is where people get the idea of a great rebellion that happened way, way back when, in sometime before Genesis 1, or between Genesis 1 and 1:1 and 1, anyway. Sometime way back when, and then you had this divine rebellion. But what does it seem to be, this rebellion seem to be attached to? Is it attached to before creation, or is it attached to this woman giving birth? Birth of the child, right? And we'll keep reading here, but it's going to be pretty clear who this child is. So it says, his tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. So we're not going to get into all the chronology here in the 1,260 days, but does anybody have an idea of who the child is? Jesus, right? One who's to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Then he's caught up to heaven. And so you've got this dragon seeking to devour the child. And you've got Jesus on the earth. What is Satan trying to do? He's trying to take him out. Of course, he doesn't realize, according to 1 Corinthians 2, the wisdom and the plan of God, that this was the plan from the beginning. And it says in 1 Corinthians 2 that if they knew that, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. So then what happens? Jesus raises from the dead. He ascends into heaven. Right? So he's caught up to the Lord. You see the picture here? This is a prophecy in the stars about the birth of Christ. Okay, so hopefully this isn't going to be too weird for people, but you got a woman, a virgin, in the sky giving birth, right? So the constellation Virgo is a picture of a woman. And if you look at the movement of the sun and the moon, which seem to move along an imaginary line that they call, thank you, anyway, that seem to move along this imaginary line, and for about 20 days out of the year, the sun seems to be in the midst of this woman. And so the idea of her being clothed with the sun. I know this is way different than anything I usually do, so bear with me. There's 20 days out of the year, this woman seems to be clothed with the sun, where the sun is in the midst of the constellation. But for the moon to be at her feet, that only happens in a 90-minute window out of the year, okay? So for those two things to come together, that's a 90-minute window. So hopefully that was clear. 90-minute window out of the year. Now then, if we look back to the time of Christ, there's only so many years that could happen. People estimate Jesus' birth somewhere between 2 and 6 BC. Okay, so Jesus was born before Christ. However that works. We got the dates wrong way back when, and it's always been that way. So Jesus was born sometime before Christ, and anyway, so you got that window in there, but then here's what often is not brought in. This right here is often not brought into that because people are looking for some conjunction of Jupiter and some other star. So when you bring this in, it narrows everything down. So get this. Somewhere below the woman, there's two candidates for the dragon. You've got kind of to one side of her this constellation called Hydra. But then directly below her, you have two constellations, but in the ancient world, they were one. So the two constellations are Libra, which is a picture of scales, and then you've got, right under it, I wrote it down. Where is it? Scorpio, all right? So those two were considered one in the ancient world, and they called it the dragon. So was it Hydra over here, or was it this, these two here? I don't know. They're both below her, so there seems to be this dragon, this serpent-like creature, ready to devour the child. Is this all making sense? Okay. Now, what was above her head? A crown of, the constellation above her is Leo, all right? And there's 9 stars in Leo, but there's 3 planets that directly align with one another. I'm trying to remember. Mercury, Venus, Mars? Anyway, so that brings you to a grand total of 12, right? Now, here's what's interesting. What, again, was our star that seems to move around? Okay, so when this sign appeared in heaven, which, again, is 90-minute window, there is also, on one of the dates that could have been the birth of Jesus, there was a conjunction of Jupiter and a star within Leo. The star is called Regulus. Okay, now here's what's interesting. Jupiter is called the king planet. Does anybody want to venture a guess why? It's the biggest one, right? Regulus is called the king star. Okay, so in Leo, you have a conjunction of the king planet and the king star. Now, to an ancient person, a pagan or what have you, they would see a conjunction of the king planet and a king star as the announcement of some type of a divine king being born. But the fact that it happened within Leo, is anybody thinking of the Lion of the tribe of Judah? This is how Jewish people would be looking at this. They're saying there's a king, so get in the Magi's head, right? Conjunction of the king planet and the king star within Leo. They're like, there's a king being born of the tribe of Judah because Leo is a lion. Yeah, Leo the lion. Thank you. Yeah. So let me just bring a couple scriptures in to kind of highlight that, okay? So you have in Matthew 2, you don't have to turn here, but it says that wise men came saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." And then later in the chapter it says, "Behold, the star that they had seen when it rose, it went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy." So they see the star rising, and it's moving. So remember Jupiter, retrograde motion, moves around. Where would they have gotten this message that a king of the Jews was being born? Well, if the king planet and the king star came into alignment, into a conjunction, in the constellation that's the lion, and if you're, from a Jewish perspective, you're thinking Judah, right? So you're seeing a king, divine king, being born to the Jews of the tribe of Judah, all right? Does that make sense? Okay. And then you throw on top of that the whole woman thing with the moon at her feet and the sun in her midsection. You have a woman pregnant, right? Being clothed with the sun, about to give birth. What's she going to give birth to? A king from the tribe of Judah, right? So this is what they're seeing in the heavens. Now, all of this happens in only a 90-minute window, and when we bring in this whole idea of Jupiter and Regulus, all of that happened. There's only one date that could have happened, and that is September 11th, 3 BC. Now, maybe that doesn't mean a lot to you, except September 11th as an American means a lot to people. But let me give you the Jewish, the biblical date. It's the first day of the 7th month, Tishri 1, also known as Rosh Hashanah, or the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Teruah. The day on which a trumpet would be sounded for the people. Also the day on which traditionally kings of the tribe of Judah would have been inaugurated officially as king. So you have the king planet and the king star coming together in Leo, the lion of the tribe of Judah, and you have the woman about to give birth, and it all happens on the day when trumpets would be sounded, calling the people to attention that God is their king, but also the day on which many kings of the tribe of Judah were inaugurated as king. Is this bit making sense? Is it coming together? Okay, so let's just look at a couple passages. Where would they be getting some of these ideas of Judah and the lion and the star? Okay, Genesis 49. This is Jacob's blessing over his sons. Now, if you actually read this chapter, most of what Jacob says doesn't feel like a blessing. I mean, have you read some of these? It's like what he says over Dan and over Simeon and Levi. It's like, thanks, Dad. I mean, like reminds them of like their dirty laundry and says, yeah, bad things are going to happen. I don't want to be associated with you. It's like, I thought this was a blessing. But then you get to Judah, and it's like, awesome. And I'm only going to read 2 verses here, but he says, Judah is a lion's cub. This is verse 9. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down. He crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. Now, some of your translations might say a little different there. This is a notoriously difficult passage to translate, so I'm not going to get into that. Okay, here's the next passage, and I think you should see a connection here. So here's where we get the idea of Judah and the lion. Does that make sense? So the Revelation 5:5, the lion of the tribe of Judah, that comes from right here, this blessing over Judah from his father Jacob. So this is Numbers 24, and this is when, you remember Balaam, the sorcerer, kind of, is he a good guy, is he a bad guy prophet dude? Yeah? Remember this guy? Talking donkey, that might... that one always gets people, right? It's a talking donkey. It's the only other place you get a talking animal besides the garden. So Balaam is he's being hired to curse Israel, right? But when he opens his mouth, all he can do is bless them. Okay. So in one of these oracles or blessings that he gives, this is Numbers 24, verse 7. And I just want to read a few verses here. He says, water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. His king, so who are we talking about? Israel, right? We're talking about the people of Israel. Israel's king his king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. So we're talking about a king, and then it goes on, God brings him out of Egypt, and is for him like the horns of the wild ox. He shall eat up the nations, his adversaries, and shall break their bones in pieces and pierce them through with his arrows. Now, focus on verse 9 here. He crouched, he lay down like a lion, and like a lioness, who will rouse him up? Is this sounding familiar? It's actually verbatim what we just read, at least in Hebrew, I think. From, English it looks a little different. But look in Genesis 49, back to Genesis 49. Judah's a lion's cub, right? He stooped down, he crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? And what's the very next thing that's told about Judah, this lion tribe? The scepter, the ruler's staff. So a ruler is going to come from Judah. Now we're talking about Israel's king, and the king is described like a lion. Are you seeing the connection points here? Okay, I say all that because just a few verses later, in verse 17, so we're back in Numbers 24, he just made the connection to the king and to the lion. So everybody who's hearing this is remembering the blessing over Judah. If you're a good Israelite, you're hearing this, you're like, he's talking about the king that's supposed to come from Judah, right? So verse 17, he says, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter, remember the scepter that won't depart from Judah, shall rise out of Israel. So where would wise men, magi in the east, be getting this idea of a star announcing the birth of a royal king from the line of Judah? Well, they'd get it from Genesis 49 and Numbers 24. And from just the very idea throughout Scripture that God communicates through the heavens. Are you seeing this? What I'm saying is this is not weird, new agey zodiac stuff, and I implore you not to get weird about this. And not to go off into weird stuff. We want to stay biblically rooted and grounded in this because we don't want to get deceived and caught up into all the weirdness that's out there, because there's plenty of weirdness. That is not from the Bible. And what I'm saying is this whole idea, everything we've been talking about, all I've been doing is reading Bible scriptures to you and talking about some constellations that happened to appear around the time that Jesus could have been born. And I find it compelling. I think maybe for some of you, you might find it compelling. And where does it land at? It lands us in the fall, which with our funny math with the whole Zechariah and Abiah, landed us somewhere in the fall. But this, I feel like you got a little bit more to hang on. With Revelation 12, with Matthew and the star that's moving. And so I think it's pretty compelling for me. Now, this sign, or a sign like it, it's not exactly the same sign, but in 2017 appeared. I think it was September 23rd. Some of you might have heard about it. There's a lot of people saying Jesus was going to come back September 23rd, which just happened to be Rosh Hashanah 3 years ago. Now, I didn't believe that because I have a particular view about the return of Jesus. I don't believe that the church will be raptured before the time of the Great Tribulation. So I think we're going to be here. I think we're going to be moving with the Lord. I think that we're going to be doing great signs and mighty exploits with the Lord. I think it's going to be scary, but the most exciting time to be alive, and I'm not afraid of it. So, enough about that. So that sign appeared. Now, it was a little different because instead of Jupiter being this conjunction with Regulus, Jupiter was actually within the midsection of Virgo and seemed to be moving up and down almost like a woman in labor, and then came down. And so people were like, Jesus is going to come back, the rapture is going to happen. And I was like, no, it's not. Actually, things are probably going to get worse, and here we are. So anyway, but, you know, if you remember what Pastor Ed has been talking about with this fullness of time moment, specifically with America, what happened only a month before that was that first solar eclipse that went right across our nation. And in just a couple years, it's going to cross our nation again. And where's the crossing point going to be? It's going to be in Cairo, Illinois, also known as Little Egypt. I think that could be a message to our nation. Let my people go. That it's time to come out of Egypt, and it's time to come out of those systems that have bound and locked people up. But what do we get just a month later, which I think everybody could see, was this Revelation 12 sign. And people were saying it was Jesus coming, but maybe it was God trying to get the church's attention and saying, hey, I came and I was born in a moment, or maybe I was. I'm trying to be humble about this because I can't say, I'm not a scientist or an astronomer or a scholar or anything like that. But Jesus could very well have been born on a day like that. And for what would be the point of him sending a message like that? Well, I think of Galatians 4, and I just want to read this passage, and maybe we'll bring it to a close with this. So if we could get some music, and we'll just kind of begin to focus our hearts on the Lord. And so it says in Galatians 4, this is in verse 4, it says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that they might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. Now this letter Paul is writing, he says it several times. He's perplexed, he's in anguish, because the believers in Galatia seem to be moving away from what Paul originally gave them and what he taught them, the beauty and the glory of the gospel of God. And so he's saying, hey, guys, I'm calling you back to what I taught you, the truth, the gospel that I passed on to you. And then he says in verse 19, this little just heart cry coming out of Paul. He says, this is right just a few verses after he talks about Jesus, the Son, coming in this fullness of time moment, born of a woman. Now remember Revelation 12. And then he says, my little children, verse 19, for whom I am in the anguish of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. So he's saying, hey, in the fullness of time, a son, Jesus, came to deliver us as his sons. And my prayer and my heart's cry, in fact, I'm in anguish about this, like childbirth, to see Christ formed in you. So what could the Revelation 12 sign in the heavens a few years ago been communicating to the church, if anything? It's church, it's time for Christ to be formed in you. Now, I know that Jesus lives in me. He's in my heart, right? But what does it mean for Paul to talk to believers? Jesus is already in them, right? And talk about Christ being formed in their hearts. What is forming us? Or maybe the better question is, what is being formed in us, right? Because we're all being transformed. We're all being conformed to an image. And the glory of the gospel is that Jesus, the very image of the invisible God, came so that his Spirit could dwell within us, so that we could be conformed into that same image. So during this season, really this whole year, it's been a big heads up, at least for me, where the Holy Spirit keeps checking my heart and keeps saying, what's forming you right now? Whose image are you being transformed into? Or again, maybe better question, what Paul's question would be, what's being formed in you? What kind of fruit is coming out of you? Is it the image of God? Or is it some other image? Is it fruit that remains? Or is it shriveled up, rotten fruit? And so we have a choice to make. And so what I see in Revelation 12, we didn't read the whole passage, but this woman gives birth to a son who's to rule over the nations, that son is caught up to heaven, and then the dragon that was trying to devour the son, what does he now go after? He goes after the woman. And then later in the passage it says he goes after the woman and all her offspring. And it says these offspring are those who keep the commandments of God. They're believers. They're people who follow God. And so what's interesting about that whole sign in heaven is what's true of the Son, the one that's born and caught up to heaven, becomes true of us. The same dragon that was going after him is going after us. And just like he conquered, Revelation 12 said, they conquered by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, loving not their lives even unto death. What's true of him because of what he did becomes true of us. He's going to rule with a rod of iron. What does he say in Revelation, I think it's 2? To him who overcomes, you'll sit with me at my right hand or on my throne. He says, and you will rule with a rod of iron. We're going to rule and to reign with him, and we don't have to wait to do that. We can start doing that now. We can step into that reality now. And where does ruling and reigning begin? I think of Genesis 4. What does he say to Cain? Cain's angry. His face is falling. He says, why are you angry? If you do right, you'll be lifted up. And then he says, hey, listen to me, Cain. Sin is crouching at your door. It wants to master you, but you must rule over it. Ruling and reigning begins here, and it begins here. And so when we look at this whole idea of when was Jesus born, to me, it's this whole message of the Christ child being conceived and being birthed in a season of time. But as Paul's praying, the Christ wants to be conceived in us. And what I mean is his nature, his character, who he is, wants to be put on display, be made manifest within our very being, that Christ would be formed in our hearts. And so, John 1:14, the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. What happens when you go back 9 months from Tishri 1 or that September-October season? It's going to take you to at least the season of Hanukkah, right? Now, maybe Mary was only 8.5 months pregnant. Again, it's an estimation, right? So if you go back, you're at Hanukkah time, right? And Hanukkah is another celebration like Tabernacles. It's an 8-day celebration. Guess what? Tabernacles is an 8-day celebration. It's a 7, and then they tack on an 8th day, right? So you have this idea of the temple, the dwelling of God, being dedicated unto the Lord. Guess when that happened? Solomon dedicated the temple on Tabernacles. The Maccabees rededicated the temple during Hanukkah. So it's very likely, and I hold this lightly, because if I love the truth and I'm presented with new information, I'm going to humble myself and I'm going to say, you know what, I was wrong. That's what it means to be a lover of truth. It means you love the truth more than you love being right. Okay? But I think this is pretty powerful. If Jesus was conceived during Hanukkah as the light of the world, which is all about the rededication of the temple, and he was born on Rosh Hashanah, which is just a couple weeks before Tabernacles, and the Word became flesh and tabernacled in our midst. It's this whole bookends of tabernacles to tabernacles idea. Whether or not it's those days, it's those seasons, I think. And so, in the same way, Christ wants to be conceived in our hearts. And this is a season, even though we're a little bit beyond Hanukkah at this point, it's a season of conceiving Christ in our hearts and allowing Christ, the character of Christ, the nature of Christ, his thoughts begin to dominate our thoughts. What happens when you get pregnant? I know nothing about this. I've seen it though, 3 times. What happens? Your shape begins to change, right? Your priorities and your schedule begin to change, whether you like it or not. Your taste and your diet begin to change. You get weird cravings you never had before, and hopefully you're thinking about the baby and you're trying to eat well. My point is, things begin to change. Everything in your life, your time, your money, your diet, your sleep, everything begins to change because it's all centered around this child and bringing this child forth. And if Christ wants to be formed and conceived in our hearts, are some things going to need to change? Yeah, everything is changing. Everything is, and maybe it's not this massive, radical change. Maybe it's those little things. Just allowing Him to reorient our life and the way we look at things, the way we organize our time, and the way we prioritize things and our goals, and allowing Him to put His finger on all of that. And just like Mary, just having that heart cry that says, Lord, I don't know what it's going to look like. It's honestly a little scary to me. I'm a little teenage girl, and the idea of being pregnant and having to face people and deal with the ridicule and just even the responsibility of carrying something as important as like the Messiah, like this seems like a big deal. Like what if Joseph drops him on his head? Like that could really happen. Like I've seen him. He drops his tools all the time. Like I'm just saying, like things could have gone really bad. And there was a big sense of urgency and responsibility. But Mary's prayer was, I'm the servant of the Lord. Let it be done unto me according to your word. And so that's the cry, even just during this season, when quite possibly Jesus was conceived in Mary's womb, that we would say, Lord, be formed within us. We want to see the character and the nature of Christ formed in us, that we could be those that bear much fruit, and we be those that give birth to something that is of eternal value, to give birth to kingdom reality in this age. And what did we just say? That earlier we prayed this. The kingdom consists of righteousness, peace, and joy, that we would conceive and give birth to these realities on the earth. And so I just encourage you. I know we already came down to the altar, but if you'd like to come and respond to the Lord, of course you can do that at your seat. But I just encourage you to just come respond to the Lord just for at least a few moments here and say, like Mary, Lord, my desire is that you would be formed in my heart. I want to be formed and fashioned into your very image. So let it be done to me according to your word. Do what you have to do, Jesus.